Okay, so if you have not listened to the introduction to this book before listening to this chapter, I highly recommend. This book is 100% factual for the most part. It talks about like a couple of instances where it made up in the introduction. But it is definitely not for the faint of heart. It has probably a laundry list of triggers, but I have not looked those up because I have not wanted to spoil the book. You can look those up for yourself. The book is just Zodiac. Also, I do apologize if I mispronounce any names or places. I would really appreciate if you knew the names or places to provide a phonetic spelling in the comments. I am not going to look those up either. I do apologize. So if you really care about pronunciations, those might be in the comments, might not. But without further ado, this is chapter 1 of Zodiac, David Farday and Betty Lou Jensen. Friday, December 20th, 1968. When he hiked in the rolling hills overlooking Vejito, David Farday could catch glimpses of the Golden Gate Bridge, the saltwater fishermen, sailboats and speedboats in San Pablo Bay, and the wide tree-lined streets of the town. He could make out the black skeletal derricks, the piers, battleships, brick smokestacks, and three-tiered warehouses of Mare Island, the great gray mass lying across the straits. In World War II, thousands swarmed to the area to do Navy work, and Vejito was transformed into a boomtown. Cheap housing units of plywood and plasterboard were thrown up, temporary constructions. By the 1960s, they had become permanent black ghettos, foresters of race hatred and gang violence that reached into the high schools. Fosterers of race hatred and gang violence. David Arthur Farday, 17, a scholar and varsity athlete, was one of the top students at Vejito High School. As 1968 drew to a close, David had met a pretty, dark-haired 16-year-old Betty Lou Jensen who lived across town. He had been going over to see her almost every day since. Today at 5 p.m., David and Betty Lou were talking with some friends on Annette Street about their date for that night. It was to be their first date together. David left at 6, and at 7:10 drove his sister Debbie to a meeting of the Rainbow Girls at the Pythian Castle on Sonoma Boulevard. David told Debbie that he and Betty Lou might be going out to Lake Herman Road at the end of their date because he'd heard a bunch of kids were going out there tonight. David returned home to his parents' green, brown shingled, T-shaped house on Sereno Drive, surrounded by a manicured hedge and two massive round shrubs, all dwarfed by the soaring poplar tree on the right. By 7:20, David was dressing for his date. He wore a light blue long-sleeve shirt, brown corduroy Levi-type pants, black socks, and tan rough leather low-cut boots. He put his Timex wristwatch with chrome case and band on his left wrist and shoved $1.55, all in change, in his right front pants pocket. He pocketed a white handkerchief and a small bottle of Bianca breath drops. On the middle finger of his left hand, he fitted his yellow metal clasped ring with its red stone. David combed his short brown hair diagonally across his forehead, above large intelligent eyes and a generous mouth, then slipped on his beige sports coat. David said goodbye to his parents and left the house at 7:30. He took a deep breath of the very cool night air. It was only 22 degrees, and walked to the 1961 Rambler brown and beige four-door station wagon that was registered in his mother's name. He backed the Rambler out of the driveway and took Fairgrounds Drive to Interstate Highway 80 for the 1 1/4 miles to the Georgia Street exit. From Georgia, David made a right turn on Hazelwood and rode on Hazelwood until he came to 123 Ridgewood, a low, flat house bordered by ivy and lean, tall trees. David pulled to a stop in front. It was 8 o'clock. Betty Lou Jensen, like David, was hardworking, studious, serious, and had a spotless reputation. As far as her parents knew, she and David were going to a Christmas Carol concert at her school, Hogan High, only a few blocks away. Betty Lou took one last look in the mirror and adjusted the colored ribbon in her hair. Her long brown straight hair framed her face and came down over her shoulders. She was wearing a purple mini dress with white cuffs and collar that made her dark, widely spaced eyes look mysterious. She had on black T-strap shoes. Betty Lou looked nervously over her right shoulder toward the window to be sure the blinds were drawn. She often told her sister Melody that she thought a boy from school was spying on her, and on several occasions Mrs. Jensen had found the gate open leading to the side of the house. A classmate, or was someone else spying on her? While he waited for Betty Lou, David spoke with her father, Vern. Her parents were from the Midwest, but Betty Lou had been born in Colorado like David's mother. When Betty Lou came out, David helped her with her white fur coat. Purse in hand, she kissed her dad goodbye, told him that they were going to a party after the concert, and at 8:20 left, promising to be back by 11. Instead of going to the concert, the two went to visit Sharon, another student on Brentwood, close to the school. At 9, Sharon walked them out to their car. They didn't say where they were going next. At the same time, out on Lake Herman Road, a few miles east of the Vallejo city limits, two raccoon hunters who had just parked their red pickup inside of the Marshall Ranch noticed a white four-door hardtop 60 Chevrolet Impala parked by the entrance to the Benissa Water Plumbing Station. There was a truck coming out of the pumping station gate onto the isolated road at the time. At 9:30, an unusual incident occurred at the spot. A boy in his date had parked the girl's sports car just off the winding road so he could adjust its motor. Both saw a car, possibly a blue Valiant, coming down the road from Benita into Vallejo. As the car passed the couple, it slowed, went a few yards down the road, and stopped in the middle of the road. They saw its white backup lights come on, and then the car started backing up toward them with excruciating slowness. There was such menace, such an aura of malignancy about the actions that the youth put his date's car in gear and took off at high speed. The Valiant followed them. When the couple got to the Benicia turnoff, they turned. The other car continued straight ahead. At 10 p.m., Bingo Welcher, a sheep herder at the old Borges Ranch, was checking his sheep in the area east off the Benicia pumping station when he noticed a white Chevrolet Impala sedan parked by the entrance to the station in front of the gate. He also saw the raccoon hunter's 49 Ford truck. After Betty Lou and David had a Coke at Mr. Ed's, a local drive-in, they drove east on Georgia and turned left onto Columbus Parkway. At the city limits of Vallejo, David turned right onto narrow, winding Lake Herman Road. They passed the great towers of the SVAR Rock and Asphalt Paving Materials Company, its machinery eating away at an orange and tan mountainside. There were silver mines here, and David had heard of two men who planned on operating a quicksilver mine in the farmland. Small ranches crowded the road the first mile. By day, the hillsides were dotted with black and white cows grazing on the pale yellow hills against sharp blue skies. Now the night slid thick and black behind the beams of the Rambler's headlights. David and Betty Lou headed east to a remote lover's lane. Police traveled it periodically, warning couples of the possible dangers of parking in such an isolated area. Just before 10:15, David pulled off the road to the right and parked 15 feet off it, facing south in the graveled area outside gate number 10, the chain-linked fence entrance to the Lake Herman pumping station. He locked all four doors, put Betty Lou's white fur coat and purse and his own sport coat on the seat behind the driver's seat, and turned on the car heater. He tilted the adjustable front seat back to a 45-degree angle. There were no lamp poles, and the rocky clearing was surrounded by gently mounded hills and farmland. The spot was popular for lovers because the kids could see the lights from any police cruiser as it came around the curve in the road, which gave them time to get rid of beer or grass. At 10:15, a woman and her boyfriend, a sailor, drove by. When they reached the end of the road and came back past 15 minutes later, the car was still there, but was now facing out toward the road in a southeast direction. At 10:50, Mrs. Stellar Borgs arrived at her ranch on Lake Herman Road, exactly 2 7/10 miles from where Betty Lou and David were parked. As Mrs. Borgs came in the door, the phone rang and she began a conversation with her mother. They agreed that Mrs. Borgs could pick up her 13-year-old son at a show later that night. At 11, Mrs. Peggy Yor and her husband Homer drove out to Lake Herman Road in their gold 67 Grand Prix to check out the sewer and water pipes his company was installing near the pump house. When they passed the Rambler, Mrs. Yor saw David sitting in the driver's seat and the girl leaning against his shoulder. When the lights from the Yor's car illuminated the gate area, she could see David put his hands on the steering wheel. After looking over the construction site, the Yors went to the bottom of the hill and turned into the Marshall Ranch to go back toward Benicia. They could see the raccoon hunter's red pickup parked in the field 25 feet in. The 2 hunters in stocking caps and hunting jackets were in the truck. After turning around, the Yors came back past the Rambler. David and Betty Lou were still sitting in the same position. The raccoon hunters had returned to their pickup by walking up the road on the side of the creek. They had been about to leave when they saw the Yors' car pull into the driveway. It was 11:05 when they finally left, and both men noticed the Rambler parked alone by the gate, now facing in toward it. When another car came around the bend in the road and caught them in its headlights, like glowing eyes peeking over a hill, Betty Lou and David may have been holding each other. Instead of passing the station wagon, this car pulled up next to them, to their right about 10 feet away. The figure in the car was probably in silhouette, hunched and stocky by the surrounding dark hills, flat as a paper cutout. In the darkness, there may have been a momentary glint of light, as if from glasses. The man was wearing a windbreaker. There the 2 cars sat side by side, just off a desolate country road. At 11:10, a worker from Humble Oil in Benicia was on his way home when he passed the Rambler at the gate. He noticed it, but the make and color of the other car failed to register with him. The oil worker's auto disappeared in the distance. A dry breeze rattled the frozen grass along the road. This is what may have happened next. The new arrival finally rolled his window down and spoke to David and Betty Lou, asking them to get out of the car. Astonished, the young couple refused. The stocky man opened his car door, and as he got out, he pulled a gun from under his dark jacket. The stranger stood glaring down at Betty Lou, whose window was open. Instead of forcing himself in through the most obvious entry on the passenger side, the stranger began stalking around the car. He paused, aimed at the rear right window just off-center, above the chrome stripping in its lower part, and fired a bullet. It shattered the glass. He moved to the other side of the car and fired a bullet into the left rear wheel housing. His intention seemed to be to herd the youngsters out of the right side of the car. He succeeded. As both of the teenagers scrambled out of the passenger side, the stranger raced around to the right side of the car. Betty Lou had gotten out. As David slid across the street and turned his head, getting out, the man reached through the open left window with the gun and pressed the barrel behind the upper part of the boy's left ear and pulled the trigger. The bullet angled horizontally above, leaving behind the powder burns of a contact wound. It exploded the boy's skull. Betty Lou screamed and ran northward, parallel with the road and toward Valido. Racing after the girl, gun extended, less than 10 feet behind her, the stalking man shot Betty Lou 5 times. He hit her in a tight pattern in the upper right portion of her back. This was incredible marksmanship, a moving target, a moving gunman running over gravel, on an almost totally dark country road. Betty Lou fell dead exactly 28 feet and 6 inches from the Rambler's rear bumper. The fleeing girl had never even reached the pavement of the road. She lay on her right side, face down, her feet to the west. David was on his back, feet pointing toward the right rear wheel. He was breathing in an almost imperceptible rasp. A large pool of blood was beginning to form about his head. The stalking man backed his sedan up and drove away down the dark, twisting road. Mrs. Borgs, still in her coat, hung up the phone and got her mother-in-law and daughter for the drive in Benicia. She glanced at the kitchen clock. It was 11:10. It took her 4 to 5 minutes at 35 miles an hour to reach the site where David had parked. As she turned the corner of the road at the edge of the chain-link fence, her headlights illuminated the dreadful sight. At first, Mrs. Borgs thought the man had fallen out of the car. Then near a yellow diamond traffic sign, she saw Betty Lou. The right front door of the Rambler was still open. The hum of its heater was audible in the stillness. Mrs. Borges accelerated down the narrow throughway to Benicia looking for help, reaching speeds of 60 to 70 miles per hour. Just north of Interstate 680, she saw a Benicia patrol car and began to honk and blink her lights to get their attention. The two cars pulled to a stop in front of the Onco station on East 2nd Street, and she told them of the horror at the edge of the road. It was 11:19. The police cruiser proceeded with flashing blue lights to the scene of the attack and arrived in 3 minutes. The officers, Captain Daniel Pita and Officer William T. Warner, detected shallow breathing from the boy and called for an ambulance. They checked over the two-tone Rambler. The motor was lukewarm, the ignition switched on, the right front door wide open, the other 3 doors and tailgate all locked. They found an expended .22 casing on the right front floorboard of the car. Because the ground and gravel area was frozen, there were no visible tire tracks or signs of a struggle. They covered Betty Lou with a wool blanket. The large pool of blood that had collected around her body had come mainly from her nose and mouth. The trail of blood led back to the car. David was lying face up. Captain Pitta could see from the dark area around the wound at his left ear that the bullet had been fired at close range. There was a large lump on his right cheek and blood on his hands and the sleeves of his shirt. Warner made a chalk outline of the still figure, its feet close to the car's right front door. The blackness was sliced by the red lights of an A1 ambulance. It slid to a stop. David was picked up on a stretcher and placed in the back of the vehicle for a mile-a-minute, siren-screeching trip to Vallejo General Hospital. On the way, a doctor worked over him. At 11:29, Peter called County Coroner Dan Horan. Since the attack had occurred in an unincorporated section of Solano County, one out of the jurisdiction of the Benicia Police, he notified the Solano County Sheriff's Office by radio and requested a unit and an investigator. Horan dressed quickly. By midnight, he was at the now bustling scene with Dr. Brian Sanford of Benicia. Horan had a habit of taking on all the stress of such a tragedy, notifying the families of the victims in person. This stress contributed to a heart condition that eventually forced him to resign. Sanford pronounced Betty Lou dead on the scene, DOS, and ordered the body removed for autopsy. First pictures were taken from as many angles as possible. A reporter from the Fairfield Daily Republic, Thomas D. Balmer, had arrived earlier, but was kept back until the sheriff's investigator arrived at 12:05 a.m. Detective Sergeant Les Lundbald handled 2, maybe 3 murders in an entire year. Now he stood thoughtfully in the blackness and coolness of Lake Herman Road, his small brimmed hat pulled down over his battered, weather-lined country face. He had rarely been without that hat since he'd become a detective sergeant for the sheriff's office in 1963. Lundbald made a sketch of the scene, working by his flashlight and the floodlight set up for the photographers and fingerprint men. The stillness was punctuated by the static of the radios from the police cars that now rimmed the road. Lundbald ordered his men, Officers Butterbotch and Waterman, to the hospital to get a statement from David. At 12:23, they arrived at the intensive care unit, saw out Nurse Barbara Lowe, and were told that the boy had arrived at the hospital DOA. He had been pronounced dead at 12:05. The officers called the sheriff's office and had Deputy J.R. Wilson come to the facility, where he took photos of the close-range powder burns on the boy's left ear, the lump on his right cheek, and the blood-matted hair. Out on Lake Herman Road, the Rambler was dusted for latent prints. Then the policemen fanned out and began searching for the gun and other possible clues. The Benicia officers took measurements. Lundbald recorded them. The photos and evidence gathered by the Benicia police would be turned over to the Solano County Sheriff's Office. Pita and Warner had preserved a fairly good crime scene. The body had been isolated from its surroundings and nothing had been moved until it had been photographed, identified, and painstakingly measured so that the evidence could be brought to court untainted. Even so, there were scant tangible clues. Checks were done for semen. Beyond the chalk outline of the boy's head were even more empty shell casings. Altogether, 9 more expended casings were recovered. The murder weapon proved likely to be a .22 caliber J.C. Higgins Model 80 or High Standard Model 101. The bullets were Super X copper-coated long rifle ammo made by Winchester since October 1967, which made it pretty new. A ricochet mark was found on the roof of the station wagon, and very slight shoe prints were found in front of the parked car leading to the passenger side. Also, a deep heel print was found behind the pump house beyond the locked fence. One of the ambulance attendants noted that he had never seen so much blood by the side of a road in his entire life. It was an exceptionally gruesome case of double murder, concluded Lundbald. At 1:04 a.m., Lundbald left for Toledo General and then went on to the Colonial Chapel's funeral home, where he met with Butcher, Bach, and Waterman to confer with Horan on the position of the bullets in Betty Lou Jensen's body. Lundbald stood in the shadows. Under the glare of the fluorescent lamps, the mortician removed the clothing from the girl's body. Abruptly, an object fell from her white and pink panties and rolled across the floor to Lundbald's boots. The detective slowly bent down and picked it up. It was a .22 caliber pellet that had been trapped after passing through Betty Lou's body. Grimly, Lundbald placed the slug in a pill bottle, gathered up the bloody clothing, and returned to his office. Butterbach and Waterman worked until 4:30 a.m. and then called it a night. An autopsy was performed on Betty Lou at noon and on David an hour and a half later. It was at 1:34 that Dr. S. Shirani, the pathologist, found the bullet that had killed David, badly battered, flattened against the right side of the victim's skull. This was sent to Lundbald in cotton. From the victims in the vehicle, 7 slugs were reclaimed. 4 of these slugs were in good condition, the remaining 3 in damaged condition. 2 were never recovered, lost somewhere in the field by Lake Herman Road. Each recovered bullet had a right-hand clockwise twist with 6 lands and 6 grooves, a 6 and 6. When a gun is made, a rod studded with metal burrs, a broach, is drawn through the barrel, leaving behind a spiral set of imperfections, the rifling. This cuts into the fired bullet's sides, making it rotate and giving it better flight steadiness as it leaves the barrel. The process also leaves identifying markings on the bullet. These are called grooves, the spiral notches, and lands, the spaces in between the grooves. Like fingerprints, the imprints make the slug unique to the gun it was fired from. Under a comparison microscope, ejector, and extractor, marks can also link a spent shell to a specific gun. As Lundbald put it, the investigation would be handled like the limbs on a tree. He would methodically follow each lead as it branched from the facts. He began by making mileage and time studies, driving the distances from suspects' and witnesses' homes at various speeds. The victim's last day was exactingly reconstructed minute by minute. 34 detailed statements were taken. Lundbald investigated the private lives of the 2 victims, working almost around the clock. The family and friends of Betty Lou and David were questioned, as well as the routine local suspects. Among other possibilities, there were 290 resitrants from Napa State Hospital for the insane living in the area. From Betty Lou's family, Horan learned that there was a lovesick boy who had been bugging her at school and who had threatened David. "I'm thinking about using brass knucks on you." They also suspected this boy might have been the one prowling about the yard at night. Horan passed this information on to Lundbald, who discovered the suspect had an airtight alibi. After his sister's birthday party, the boy watched Global Affair on TV until 11 in the company of a Mare Island policeman. Leads from the public were followed up. Look for a dark car without any chrome, but there seemed to be no motive to the brutal slayings, outside of for the sheer joy of it. Lundbald could find no attempt at robbery or sexual molestation of the victims. Perhaps the killing itself had served as a sexual release for the murderer. The news from Criminal Identification and Investigation, CI&I, in Sacramento was no better. In addition to subjugating to further test any J.C. Higgins Model 80 automatic pistol recovered, further tests should be made on any weapons having the following characteristics: A. Cartridge cases, semicircular firing pin impressions at 12 o'clock position, small extractor markings at 3 o'clock position, very faint ejector marking at 8 o'clock position. Latter may not always be detectable. B. Weapon barrel or test bullets, 6 right-hand grooves, land and groove ratio 1:1 plus. Bullet groove width approximately 0.056 inch. Bullet land width approximately 0.060 inch. Due to lack of sufficient unique structure, it appears that considerable difficulty will be encountered in positively identifying the responsible weapon if it should be recovered. From our examination, it appears that a conclusive identification of the responsible weapon will be extremely difficult, if not impossible, even though it should be recovered. Examination of the dress, item 9, revealed 1 hole in the front near the center and 5 holes in the upper right side of the back. No smoke or gunpowder residue was found in the vicinity of any of these holes except the topmost hole on the back. Near the latter, 1 single grain of gunpowder was found. From these examinations, it therefore appears that the weapon was held at least several feet from the victim at the time of the shooting. The minimum distance it could have been held cannot be established without testing of the responsible weapon when it is recovered. There were no witnesses, no motives, and no suspects.